welcome to Hearth of Hymonia. My name is Kate. Today we are talking about the Greek goddess Persephone and her Roman counterpart Proserpina. And every time I set out to do one of these, it sort of opens up a rabbit hole for me, and I end up finding way more information than I can possibly squeeze into one video. So this is going to be a general introduction to Persephone and her mythology and some of the themes from antiquity, and the role of her story in the modern world. So I'm going to start with some of the possibilities for where Persephone came from, how her worship developed in antiquity, but I will be spending the bulk of this video talking about the different versions of her myth that have come down to us from the ancient world, from Greek and Roman sources. And I'll finish up with the modern world of witchcraft and paganism and how Persephone fits into that world as well. So there's a lot to cover, and if there's anything you would like to know more about, anything that I mentioned but don't go into detail about that you want more information about, let me know and I can make a follow-up video about that. So who is Persephone and where does she come from? The Greek goddess Persephone has a few different names. Obviously her primary name is Persephone, but she's also known as Kore, which translates from the Greek to just mean the maiden. And this is a reference to her being the young daughter of Demeter. It's one of the older names for her, and it's a term of respect to refer to an aspect of her rather than calling her directly by name. In the same way, another name that she is known by is Despoina, which translates to mistress, and this is in reference to her being queen of the underworld. In antiquity, not universally, not everywhere and not at all times, but for a lot of antiquity, the underworld was something that you didn't really want to talk about directly. So underworld deities were often given other names, instead of saying Hades or Dis, you would call him by one of these other names so that you weren't talking about the underworld directly. You might say the King of the Shades, or you might say like the Dark One or something like that. And in the same way, Persephone was known as Despoina, mistress, queen, and she was referred to that way as opposed to calling her directly by name. It's unclear exactly where the worship of Persephone developed and when, but there is a mythological parallel to the Sumerian goddess of the underworld whose name is Ereshkigal. So Ereshkigal was kidnapped by a dragon god and brought down to the underworld where she was forced to rule down there as queen against her will. This is just a little connection to Persephone and her story. We don't know for sure whether Persephone's worship was developed out of that tradition, but it certainly seems to be related in some way. Persephone is the daughter of Demeter. Demeter is the Greek goddess of grain and agriculture more generally speaking. So Persephone is her daughter. In most versions, Persephone's father is Zeus. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time her father is Zeus. So I'm just going to roll with that version because it's represented in most of our literary sources. Zeus, obviously, king of the gods, thunder, sky god, in charge of everything, basically. Persephone was known to the Romans as Proserpina. In a lot of cases, Roman and Greek gods were related, but not necessarily the same thing. So, for example, Dionysus and Bacchus had enough differences that we should probably make a distinction between the two. This is not the case with Persephone and Proserpina. Their mythology is pretty much identical, and their worship and what they represented was pretty much identical between the two cultures. So in this case, it's one of those times where we can say this is pretty much the same goddess. Proserpina's name is probably a Latinization of Persephone, but it may also have ties to the Latin word proserpere, which means to creep forth. Now, I've read the argument that this is in reference to how grain grows, but I think it's probably more to do with Persephone's or Proserpina's return from the underworld. She sort of like like the underworld is kind of like a cave type place, and she emerges from it. And I would say that that's probably a closer association with Proserpinae than grain creeping forth from the earth, although it could be both. So anyway, that's where her name might come from. And again, we can think of them as the same goddess. On the Roman side of things, Proserpina is connected to the native Italic, so pre-Roman, goddess Libera. And we don't have a lot of information about Libera, but we know that she was the female counterpart to the Roman god Liber, who was in charge of wine, among other things. The Romans probably adopted worship of Proserpina naturally from the Greeks, but specifically from Greek colonies in southern Italy. The Greek area of southern Italy was called Magna Graecia, and it was well established by the time Rome was sort of getting its start, really getting its start. Women in Magna Graecia celebrated a festival dedicated to Persephone called the Thesmophoria, which was a women-only event. And so the Romans sort of adopted worship of Persephone and called her Proserpina, and it developed in that way. Now, something interesting. I like it because, of course, the Romans would do something like this. According to Cicero, the Romans imported priestesses of Persephone to maintain Rome's worship, Rome's cult of Proserpina, so her priestesses were Greek. And he said there were two reasons for doing this. The first is that the Romans wanted to make sure that they got the most expert priestesses, the ones who had learned from the worship of Persephone in Greece. And he said also they were given Roman citizenship when they got to Rome to run the Proserpina cult. And he said this is because as Roman citizens, they would be more invested in Rome's best interest, so they would do their very best to make sure that the Roman state was in good standing with the goddess. And I said, of course the Romans would think like that. Of course they would find a way to make syncretism like a governmental administrative type thing. It just felt very Roman to me, and I got a kick out of that. So that's part of her story as well. So that's about what we know for Persephone/Proserpina's origins. For the rest of the video, just for simplicity's sake, I'll be using the Greek names. So Persephone, Demeter, Hades, and so on. But I'll be drawing from both Greek and Roman sources, so I'll do my best to point out what sources I'm using for which part of the story. Just know that I'm only using the Greek names going forward. The story of Persephone begins in the world above. Persephone and her friends are frolicking in a field of flowers. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is a Greek source, and in Claudian's version, which is a very late Roman source. In both of those versions, they say that Athena and Artemis are part of her friend group, and they all go together into this field to pick wildflowers. Now, why Athena and Artemis? I would assume for thematic purposes, these are both goddesses who have chosen to be celibate. So I think they serve a thematic purpose here. Ovid mentions them specifically with reference to their virginity because it's looking like Persephone is going to also adopt that lifestyle. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So in pretty much every version, Demeter is not with her daughter at this point. In Claudian's version, he says that Persephone wanted to, grow up and get married, and Demeter didn't want that to happen, so Demeter sent her away to Sicily. I think Claudian is the only one that tells it that way. I think everybody else just says that Persephone is out with her friends. Meanwhile, Hades, who is the god of the underworld, wants a bride. Claudian makes a big deal out of this. Other versions treat it more or less in detail. Hades wants a bride, and in most versions he goes to his brother Zeus, who is also Persephone's father, says, I want a bride, and in most versions Zeus says, don't worry about it, you can have a bride. It has been foretold in a prophecy, that's Claudian's version, and or it has been decreed by the fates that you are going to marry this girl Persephone. So go get her. The reason that the fates thing is important is because the gods do not have control over the fates. They can ask the fates for things, but ultimately the fates have more power in the universe than even the gods do. And if the gods don't like something that is fated to happen, they literally cannot change it. So when Zeus says that it has been fated that Hades is going to marry Persephone, what he's saying is, I learned about this, and that's the extent of my control over the situation. So it's important to point that out because Zeus is Persephone's father, and he is sort of condoning her kidnapping. Spoiler alert, she gets kidnapped. But if it has been fated, there's really nothing he can do about it. So I just wanted to point that out. Ovid has two versions of this story. The version that he writes in the Fasti is pretty much identical to the Homeric hymn, so I'm really not going to reference Ovid too much in terms of his Fasti version, but in his Metamorphoses version, he does not involve Zeus in this at all. He blames Venus, which if you've ever read anything by Ovid, this is the most Ovid thing that he could have done. He says that Venus is talking to her son Cupid, little baby arrow cherub guy, and she says, I feel threatened by the fact that I have no control in the underworld. I have power over the immortals in Olympus. I have power over all of the humans on Earth because she's the goddess of love, and all of these figures have some kind of romantic attachment. But when it comes to the underworld, Venus has no control. She's irritated by this, so she says to her son, I want to get control over Hades. I'm trying to use the Greek names. Venus is Aphrodite in Greek. She says, I want to get control over the king of the underworld. Also, I'm kind of frustrated that it looks like Persephone is going to follow in the footsteps of Athena and Artemis. They are chosen virgins, which means that I have no jurisdiction over them either, because they are not interested in romance at all. So she says, shoot Hades with an arrow, one of your magic love arrows, and make him fall in love with Persephone. And so that's Ovid's Metamorphoses version, and it's so different from the other ones. And I love it because Ovid is like in a constant feud with love gods. So, of course, it would make sense that Venus would sort of be the villain in his story. And I just think that's neat. All this happens. Hades comes up from like a crack in the earth. He scoops her up. She's protesting, but he brings her down to the underworld. Once she gets down there, in most versions, this is kind of interesting to me, Persephone is very upset, loudly lamenting her fate, and Hades is moved by this, and he says, look, the situation kind of is what it is, there's nothing you can do about it, however, I'm going to try to do right by you as your future husband. A small comfort, I know. But I bring this up because ancient authors are not afraid of reporting sexual assault without any sort of qualms about it, without, oh yeah, the gods just assault people all the time. The gods assault each other, they assault mortals, sort of not a big deal. And in their cosmology, the gods don't feel bad about this. They do this without remorse. It's a part of who they are as deities. But Hades really feels bad about the whole Persephone thing. So he sort of promises her that even though he kidnapped her, which is like not a great thing, and even though he's certainly not going to give her back, nevertheless, he's going to try to make her life less miserable. Very Beauty and the Beast, very Stockholm Syndrome-y, definitely not healthy, super toxic. However, this is a detail that almost every version includes in some way or another. So it must be significant. Now, in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, as well as in Ovid's Fasti, which I said is basically the same thing, the main character is obviously Demeter. So the bulk of the story is actually about Demeter's wanderings. Obviously, she notices that her daughter has gone missing, and she travels all over the world talking to this one and that one, trying to find her. Now, it's all very interesting in its own right, but because the purpose of this video is Persephone, I'm going to sort of leave that part alone. And I'm going to resume when Demeter finds out what actually happened to Persephone. So in most versions, like in the Homeric version, for example, she finds out because Hecate, interestingly enough, heard her cries, and Helios, the sun god, also heard her cries, and because he's the sun, he sort of sees everything, so he knows what happened. Hecate has a suspicion that she can ask Helios, so she brings Demeter to Helios, who tells them both what happened. And Hecate is like part of Demeter's plan to get Persephone back. Now, the fact that Hecate shows up in Persephone's story already is a magical connection. Helios, in his own way, has magical connections. He's supposed to be related to the Aeetes family, which is like where Medea comes from, and also Hecate's thrown in there. Circe's part of that family. So he is connected to magic as well, but then obviously Hecate, as the goddess of witchcraft, is the most direct connection to magic. And this is significant because Persephone is a part of magical practice in antiquity, but I'll come back to that later. Most versions report it that way. Claudian says that Persephone actually came to Demeter in a dream, and so that's how Demeter found out, just sort of different ways of telling it. So I'm actually going to backtrack just a little bit to say that while Demeter is grieving the loss of her daughter, before she finds out what happens, as she's wandering around the earth, she's so miserable that she makes all the plants die, throws the earth into a perpetual state of winter where nothing grows, people are starving, animals are dying, humans are dying, everything is bad. And she's sort of like destroying the earth in her grief, in her distress. And so this is sort of the impetus for getting Persephone back to her. In most versions, some number and combination of gods get together to make that happen because they recognize what a big problem it is. Send a delegation to Hades. Most versions, Hermes is involved. He's the messenger god. Goes down, says, you gotta give her back. Demeter's destroying the earth. It's a real big problem. Hades really can't fight back against the whole conglomeration of gods, so he says, okay, she can have her daughter back. Because divine law is weird, there's a random rule that we didn't know about until just now. And the rule is, Persephone is allowed to return from the world of the dead to the world of the living so long as she hasn't eaten any food in the underworld. This is the most famous part of the story, so I'm sure you've heard this before. Persephone eats some pomegranate while she's in the underworld, and as a result, she cannot come back to the world of the living full time. But because it's such a problem, Zeus does all he can do, and he makes a little bit of a compromise where he says she can spend part of the year in the world above and part of the year in the underworld with Hades. Different versions have her eating different amounts of pomegranate and staying in the underworld for different amounts of time, but these are just sort of details. So Demeter, as the goddess of agriculture, makes things grow again. She's so happy to have her daughter, but for part of the year, she's thrown back into grief at being separated from her, and everything dies again. The whole point of this story is that it's an origin story, an etiology for where seasons come from. For part of the year, everything is in bloom, and for part of the year, everything goes dormant and dies. But we know that it will come back again the next year. So as Persephone moves between the world above and the underworld, things are cycling through growth and decay. That's sort of the bulk of her mythology. Claudian's story ends there. His work is presumably unfinished, but we do have some tidbits about what Persephone's life is like as queen of the underworld whenever she's down there. So I want to spend some time talking about those and why they're sort of significant to her story. As weird and Stockholmy as it is, she seems to get along with Hades quite well once this system is established, and she takes on the role of Queen of the Underworld and performs her duties very capably. She shows up in a number of places in mythology and writings from antiquity in her role as already pre-established Queen of the Underworld. So I'll mention a few. So in Book 10 of the Odyssey, Odysseus has to go down to the Underworld to get a prophecy from Tiresias, and he talks to his mother and some other people in the Underworld. Persephone is actually the one who facilitates this. So Hades isn't actually part of the story. When Odysseus goes to the Underworld, he makes a sacrifice to Persephone, and Persephone is the one who facilitates the interaction between Odysseus and all of the dead people that he needs to talk to. Humans can't just talk to dead people in the underworld. It has to, you gotta go through this ritual. Persephone oversees this ritual, so she's the one that makes it possible for Odysseus to get the information he needs. It seems like Persephone is kind of a liaison between the world of the living and the world of the dead, just because she does split her time there. So maybe that's why she's the one to facilitate the interaction between Odysseus and all of the dead people, because she is kind of liminal in her own way. I don't know, that's just a thought I had. Now, another story about a living person going to the underworld, which is probably way more famous than the Odysseus one even, is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus, also connected to ancient magic, he is madly in love with his wife Eurydice. She gets bit by a snake, she dies. He's so distraught, he's lamenting her, and he decides he's gonna go bring her back. So he's a very, very skilled musician, and he goes to the underworld and sings a song to Hades and Persephone to try and convince them to let Eurydice go back with him. In a lot of versions of this story is told over and over again. Ovid has a version. Vergil in his Georgics has a version. In many versions, Persephone is the one who ultimately makes that call. As queen of the underworld, she's able to persuade Hades. So clearly she has some kind of influence over him, which makes her a very, very powerful individual. So some of the themes that come up here, getting back to Persephone as a liminal figure, her story is a story that, she falls into one of many stories of this type, like Odysseus going down to the underworld, and like Orpheus going down to the underworld, and Aeneas going down to the underworld. You see where I'm going with this? All of those guys come back, and Persephone comes back. Now, this is a type of myth known as a catabasis. Catabasis really means like a going down, and then the other half of the story is the anabasis, you go back up. Catabasis stories are really interesting to me because they're about going down into the darkness, going through a death of some kind, coming back from that, and being changed in some way. Everyone's afraid of the death card in the tarot, but this death card to me is just catabasis. You go through a kind of death in order to be reborn into a better or a more enlightened version of yourself. Something is coming to an end, and necessarily with endings come new beginnings. So that's sort of the purpose of a catabasis myth. Odysseus goes to the underworld to learn information. Orpheus goes to the underworld in order to bring Eurydice back. Now, it doesn't work out for him, but the purpose is to get some kind of reward for going down there. Same with Aeneas. Aeneas goes down there to gain information. And the information that these heroes get helps them along their journey and ultimately helps them to fulfill their destiny, their fate, which again is the most important thing. So Persephone goes down to the underworld and she comes back changed. She now has a new role. She has moved from the maiden, the chore aspect of her life, into married life. She's the despoina of the underworld. She's the mistress of the underworld. She has a lot of power. And so she has transitioned from the sort of childlike innocence into something more powerful. Now, we can debate all day long about whether this is good or bad or whatever, but that's sort of not the purpose of the Catabasis story. The fact is, you are going to experience things in your life that are going to force you to grow. That's the idea of Catabasis, and that's one of the main themes of the Persephone myth. In my opinion, it's at least the one that I care the most about. And then obviously Persephone as a death goddess. In Homer's Odyssey, he says that the groves that are sacred to Persephone on the earth are in the extreme west. Now, the west is where the sun sets at the end of the day. It is, in most cultures around the world, at one point or another associated with death. It's sort of the end of something, and then the east is associated with birth and rising and growth and that kind of thing. So Persephone's groves are located in the far west because she is a death goddess for obvious reasons, right? Queen of the underworld, kind of hard to miss the death association there. So like I said, this is one of the most well-known stories from antiquity, and its impact in the ancient world and the modern world is borne out in a number of different cultural traditions. So the most obvious one from antiquity is the Eleusinian mysteries. Now, mystery cults from antiquity were very popular. They're called mystery cults because you're really not supposed to know what the secret initiation rituals are. But the Eleusinian mysteries were so popular in Athens at, the height of their popularity that almost everyone in the city was initiated into the cult. The Emperor Hadrian, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, got initiated into the cult. I think Julian did also. The Eleusinian mysteries, to put it very, very simply, perhaps too simply, it's a cult about immortality. It's about gaining access to immortality. And the rituals are Athens' worst kept secret, so we know a little bit about them. They were really like a reenactment of the Persephone story. So they involved going down through like this horrible experience and coming out on the other side more enlightened. You'd have access to immortality after going through that sort of traumatic experience in the initiation ritual. The Homeric hymn to Demeter basically says this explicitly. So I'm going to read you part of the Homeric hymn. I'm starting around like 470 or so, line 470. I'll put a link in the description to the version I'm reading from. It's the Greg Naj translation from the Center for Hellenic Studies. God bless them for putting it online for free. So I'm going to read from that version. Then she went to the kings, administrators of Themistès, and she showed them to Triptolemus, to Diocles, driver of horses, to powerful Eumolpus, and to Chelios, leader of the people. She revealed to them the way to perform the sacred rites, and she pointed out the ritual to all of them, the holy ritual which it is not at all possible to ignore, to find out about, or to speak out. The great awe of the gods holds back any speaking out. Blessed is he among earthbound mortals who has seen these things. But whoever is uninitiated in the rites, whoever takes no part in them, will never get a share of those sorts of things once they die, down below in the dank realms of mist. But when the resplendent goddess finished all her instructions, they, meaning Demeter and Persephone, went to Olympus to join the company of the other gods. So pretty explicitly, this is in reference to the Eleusinian mysteries. So this is the most closely associated religious ritual connected to the myth. There's also a festival in Rome dedicated to Persephone. It was called the Anthesphoria. We don't really know too much about it. It was a springtime festival, and that's about all we can say. Of Rome's many, many, many festivals, this is not one that gets a lot of press time, so we don't know too much about it. And here we are entering into a territory where I don't really know what I'm talking about. Apparently, Persephone is connected to Orphism, which is an ancient magical tradition that I know nothing about. Obviously, it's connected to Orpheus, and it appears that there were these things called gold leaves that were buried with dead members of this group or dead observers of this tradition, presumably to give the dead, a good afterlife, to sort of ensure that they would have a good afterlife. And Persephone is mentioned on a lot of these. That's the extent of my knowledge about her connection to Orphism. So she has the ancient magic connection. She's also mentioned as Queen of the Underworld on a number of curse tablets. If you haven't seen my curse tablet video, I'll link it down below, but basically a lot of curse tablets invoke underworld deities or underworld spirits to help them through the magical process. And Persephone is among these gods that are propitiated on these tablets. Now, I've said this before on the channel, I don't do deity work. I don't worship any deities. I don't work with any deities. They're not a part of my life. So necessarily, I'm going to be giving you secondhand information here. There are a lot of people who work with Persephone in the modern world, and so I sort of just hunted around online to see what I could find. So I'm going to be giving my report of my findings here, but this is not a first-hand account. If you work with Persephone and you want to share your experiences, please share them in the comments. I would love to know more about Persephone's role in people's lives today. I was only able to find a few things, but I would absolutely love to know more. So if you feel like sharing, please let me know. That would make me so happy. So one thing that was kind of unexpected for me is that Persephone, first and foremost, is worshipped as a springtime deity. Now, this makes a lot of sense, but I just was expecting her underworld association to kind of take precedence. But it seems like most people worship her in connection with springtime. She is the reason why spring happens according to Greek mythology. Her return from the underworld brought an end to Demeter's perpetual grief, and so Demeter made things grow. So I've seen that a lot of people will leave flowers, wildflowers, as offerings. Crocuses are like the first flower to pop up out of the snow at the very end of winter to signal that spring is on its way. So obviously that would make sense for Persephone. And also floral incense like lavender and rose and geranium and stuff like that. She's incorporated into general springtime seasonal observance. Now, some people who work with Persephone modern day associate her with shadow work, and this is where I was not surprised. Shadow work, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, just means sort of going into the darker aspects of yourself and examining what is sort of causing problems in your life and adjusting and coming out sort of better for it. So for some people, that is processing childhood trauma. For some people, if this is your jam, maybe even past life trauma or past life experiences in general. If that's something that you're into, that's another aspect of shadow work. Honestly, modern day shadow work is associated with therapy. So like if you go to cognitive behavioral therapy, if you're doing therapy journaling and that kind of thing and processing different parts of your life and your mind that are darker and maybe a little bit more painful, the idea is that you come out of shadow work evolved in some way. So maybe you've healed a little bit, maybe you've gained some sort of insight a little bit. And this does not surprise me that Persephone is a part of this for people who do deity work. Persephone is a goddess of Catabasis. She is a goddess of going into the depths and coming out with some kind of reward on the other side of it. Now, this is interesting. You would expect that a pomegranate would be an obvious offering to Persephone. This is what I assumed when I set out to do my research. However, this is apparently very controversial. And even though I was surprised by this, I was like, oh yeah, obviously. So in some versions of the myth, like in Ovid's Metamorphoses version of the myth, Persephone eats the pomegranate not knowing about the weird universal law that says that she can't go back to the world of the living if she eats something. She doesn't know about that. She's wandering around the underworld through the underworld orchards, and she finds some pomegranate fruit, and she decides to eat it of her own volition. So some people say, yeah, pomegranates are totally fine to offer Persephone. They're associated with her, obviously, so why not? But apparently other people look more towards like the Homeric hymn version, where Hades tricks Persephone into eating pomegranates so that she can't leave the underworld forever. And people who pay more attention to those versions tend to avoid giving her pomegranate as an offering because they don't want to piss her off by reminding her that she was tricked by Hades and now she's in this like kind of garbage situation. So I thought that was super interesting, and it shows that the details in each version of the myth play a major role in how the story is interpreted. And lastly, like I said, she's a springtime goddess. A lot of people will incorporate her into their observation of the cycle of seasons. In fall and winter, she's more of a chthonic, underworld, queen of the dead, Catabasis kind of goddess, and that's her role at that time of year. And then when it becomes springtime, she is a goddess of growth and new life and the promise of better things to come. So wrapping things up, this is one of the most famous stories from antiquity, and it's not really hard to see why. There are so many themes, not just the Catabasis theme, not just her shadow work associations, not just the darkness and the light and the changing of seasons, but it's ultimately a story about abduction. It's a story that speaks to the hesitation and maybe the fear of young women. I mean, it comes from a society where most marriages were arranged. If you're a young girl, you're marrying the person that your parents have chosen for you. He's probably older than you, significantly in some cases. You're sort of stuck in this situation. So it's a story that kind of speaks to that anxiety of young women going through that type of arranged marriage. It's a story about a mother who loses her child and will stop at nothing to get her back, and who will go to the extremes to destroy the earth in order to get her back. Now, when I was researching Persephone's role in modern witchcraft and paganism, I came across a comment. Someone said that they identify with Persephone because they also had an overbearing mother. And I thought that was a really interesting take on the story. You know, in Claudian's version, Persephone wants to get married and Demeter won't let her. Persephone is ready to sort of move past her childhood and grow into adulthood, and she's being held back by her overbearing mother. It's obviously not the only interpretation, and I would say it's not the most common interpretation, but it's certainly an interesting take. That's sort of the beauty of this story, is it speaks to different people in different ways. As for me, I love the Catabasis aspect of it. I love it because it's like a little bit goth, and I'm a little bit goth at times, so I liked that aspect of it. And even though I don't work with Persephone and I don't do deity work at all, it's a story that I keep coming back to and meditating on, and really associating with that kind of Catabasis in my own spiritual journey, I guess. But that's really all I have to say about Persephone. Again, if you want to share your own experiences, please, please, please let me know. That would be so great for me. And if there's anything else about Persephone that you want to talk about or discuss, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, if you liked this video, it would be helpful to give me a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. And if you like this kind of content and you want to see more videos about ancient belief systems, classical religion, classical magic, you can go ahead and subscribe. I am planning to post a ton more videos about stuff like this, so that way you can see the future videos that I put out. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you, and I will see you in the next video.